Okay, so fermentation is the action of microbes on a substrate, which is normally carbohydrate, but they can eat proteins, they eat lots of things, in the absence of oxygen. So no oxygen generally, although some are oxygen tolerant, and they produce various metabolites that include ethanol, so a small amount of alcohol, and carbon dioxide, and then a number of other things like lactic acid and short chain fatty acids. And there's two main pathways. So heterofermentative means they produce lots of things. They're producing acetic acid and lactic acid and other things. And then homofermentative is when they're mainly producing lactic acid. And that's what we're interested in fermented foods, is you facilitate the environment where they go from heterofermentative to homofermentative pretty quickly over a couple of days. And then they're churning out a lot of this lactic acid, which makes the foods acidic, which repels the microbes that we don't want. And our lactic acid bacteria don't mind acid at all because they produce it, so they start to thrive.
So that's interesting, because you kind of, if you're quite a fan of exercise, you tend to think about lactic acid in terms of the sort of byproduct of exercise.
Muscles,
and you think lactic acid is the thing that is cramping your muscles, but actually it's a good thing in terms of fermenting then.
Yeah, so what's happened over millennia is this understanding that this all started to preserve food. It's a way of food preservation. There was no real understanding initially of the health-giving effects, or why, certainly until recently. But lactic acid bacteria tolerate no oxygen. They don't mind salt, and they don't mind acidity. And so all we're doing mostly with fermented vegetables is creating an environment that's slightly salty and has no oxygen, and then off the lactic acid bacteria go, producing lactic acid to make it acidic, so no one else wants to hang around. So that's fermented foods, and what you get in there is a broad range of species of microbes, a naturally formed community. So probiotics is a different thing. So probiotics are still live microorganisms, but the definition is live microorganisms. I think it's when administered in sufficient or adequate amounts to confer a health benefit. But if you ever see fermented foods that say probiotic, we're not actually allowed to say that. And this is the thing that it frustrates me a little bit. So there's reasons why care has to be taken, of course, but probiotics are where you know exactly the strain of microbes in there, and inevitably with fermented vegetables or milk kefir, for example, you don't know. So I've had my milk kefir lab tested at Chagas in Ireland, and they told me who pretty much was in there on that day. But of course, it's a live and moving process, so I don't know 100% exactly who's in there. So I can't call that probiotic, and I don't know the exact amounts.
So do all fermented products contain this live microbes, but you can't say that they contain probiotics because you don't know which strain it is? But do they all have them then?
Yeah, they all have them, but also there's the risk that there's small amounts of so you'll get small amounts of pathogens or problematic bacteria as well, but it's in a balanced environment where that is managed, just like in our gut. Everyone's like, oh, I've got candida, and it's like, well, that's a normal commensal yeast in our gut. It's the levels that's the problem, not their presence per se. And so what I'm really keen on is these naturally forming communities, and this process of fermenting foods has happened, like it's sort of, we don't even know how far back. There's evidence like thousands of years back. So we know it's a very, very safe process, and we're only just really getting to understand why it might be so good for us too.
Yeah,
so
that's the real benefit. Yeah, okay.
And then prebiotic, a substrate that is selectively utilized by our host microbes. So that's like Jerusalem artichoke fiber, for example.
Yeah, so they're the stuff that feeds the probiotic. Yeah. They're like sources of fiber. Yeah, like exactly. Bananas is a good source of inulin.
Or anything. But so that's another thing that's really good about fermented vegetables, for example, is that you've got the live microbes in there, but you've also got the fiber, and the phytochemicals and the minerals that are all in the vegetables, all in one
So it's
product.
really kind of symbiotic, isn't it? You've got all the things working together as they should do in nature, rather than isolating individual
Well, I think,
bits.
I mean, it's quite interesting having trained. I trained as a medical herbalist simultaneously as I was doing the masters. So I had a really science-based course in terms of the masters, but a slightly more. It was still very science-based, but there was a lot more, I think, respect for what we don't know, and respect for not having all the answers, and for just, you know, trusting a bit sometimes that we don't. So, you know, for example, in cannabis, the use of CBD, there's this intricate balance between all of the constituents. So when you take THC out, it's extremely strong and problematic and hallucinogenic. But when you have the cannabinoids in there to counterbalance it, the effect is much more gentle. So this idea that we're going to just take one microbe and say, well, this is going to do this in your gut. I think there's certain circumstances where that is true. But for most of us, very few of us will take probiotics for the rest of our lives, and they don't tend to stay in our guts. But I can tell you that I will be eating fermented foods in some form or another for the rest of my life, and it costs me almost no money, and it's just part of our diet now, and that's available to everybody regardless of your monthly pay packet. That's possible for us to do, because all you need is some vegetables and some salt and a jar, and that is it.